through those very twisted places in ourselves, we are being churned to bring forth very specific and unique aspect of the divine consciousness, of the light of oneness, this very specific element of divinity that will not come through, will not shine forth unless you have been molded and churned and go through the pain and agony to birth this moment. Namaste, hello, and welcome to the second episode of Tantric Thoughts. As we slowly start to lay the foundation of Integral-Tantrism, today I want to talk to you about another very important pillar to understand this philosophy and approach to spirituality. This topic is a little bit difficult to speak about because it could seem a bit controversial and even counterintuitive at points. And this concept, it could be addressed as the gift of suffering. The gift of suffering is the idea that pain, struggle, suffering, in the absolute sense of things, is not separate or different by any way from the divine consciousness. And therefore, by default, is not only necessary for evolution, for growth, for the expression of this divine consciousness through the limited forms of life, but it's also good and benevolent. Pushing it even a bit farther, we can even say that the things that we perceive to be evil in life is by that extent, because they are still an expression of that divine consciousness through certain limitation, is also good by default. And here you already see this inherent contradiction. How can I say that something that is perceived to be evil, literally, is actually good and benevolent? Those are contradictory terms. In order to understand that, and we will go into those details throughout the conversation, we first of all need to understand that right now we are having a conversation in the absolute sense of things. This is not to say that on the relative sense, in the reality that we experience day to day when we walk down the street, if we see somebody in pain or suffering, or somebody, God forbid, abusing somebody else, when we experience pain and suffering in our life, we're somehow becoming ambivalent towards that or rejoiced in the presence of the pain and suffering. That's not where it's going. There is a capacity to be able to differentiate between those things and also slowly integrate them. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Now, if you grew up in a more Western or modern environment where religious or spiritual teachings are not so prevalent anymore, this idea that some kind of struggle, that challenge, even painful scenarios in life are important and necessary for your growth and development might actually not sound so controversial. It might even be quite self-evident and trivial. If that's the case, very good, we are on the same page, but slowly, hopefully throughout this talk, we will be able to take it a little bit deeper. On the other hand, if you have background in Eastern spiritual teachings, you know that the majority of Eastern spirituality is focused on something that we can describe as moksha. Moksha meaning liberation. And this idea of liberation is usually quite different from what we see in the more New Age era, where liberation or enlightenment is being associated with some kind of a superhuman state of being where everything is possible. Liberation in the East, this moksha concept, is usually liberation from suffering. And here you probably already start to see like where it becomes difficult. If the entire purpose of spiritual practice is to liberate us from suffering, how can we in the same time perceive those suffering as not separate and part of that divine consciousness? In order to explore that, we will now go briefly through some of the main Eastern philosophies, both the Orthodox and heterodox, and see how they relate to the concept of suffering and liberation, and how there is a gradual evolution throughout the ages until we come to our approach with Integral-Tantrism. The first and maybe the most easy to talk about is traditional or Orthodox Buddhism. This is to still differentiate a little bit from the later forms of Buddhism that, although they kept the main teaching, started to shift their ideas around their spiritual practice. Still, in Buddhism, we find the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. This is kind of like the main doctrine of the teachings. And within the Four Noble Truths, we find a word which is dukkha. And the purpose of the Eightfold Path, which is the practice that comes from the Four Noble Truths, is to find a way to eradicate dukkha, to not have dukkha anymore. Now, there is a more traditional interpretation or translation to the word dukkha, and there's some more modern interpretations which are a bit more loose. Traditionally, the word dukkha is being translated as suffering, and more modern translations usually prefer the idea of a dissatisfactory aspect in existence, which we have all in life, and this is this dukkha that they are trying to eradicate. However, for this argument, I will just go directly to the words of the Buddha as he bothered to actually say and to describe in his word what he means when he speaks about dukkha, so it's not really going to be left for our interpretation. In the scriptures, the Buddha says that dukkha is, first of all, birth, so the process of being born, then growing up, getting sick, getting old, and dying. So here we definitely see that there is a correlation between dukkha and physical pain. After that, the Buddha continues and he gives more examples to what is dukkha, which are more mental and emotional. For example, being departed from a loved one is dukkha, not getting what you want is dukkha, etc., etc. But in the first one, he chooses to start with things which are very physical, very tangible, that we all experience on the body level. So, in that sense, liberation, awakening, being able to see things as they are, in this more Buddhist terminology, is breaking this cycle of death and rebirth, not ever being reborn again, so there will be no more physical suffering or pain. The next spiritual tradition that I think it's appropriate to mention is Advaita Vedanta. In Advaita Vedanta, the world itself is being described as Maya, as a type of an illusion. And suffering occurs because a case of a problem in cognition. For whatever reason, we are misidentifying our true self with the material world out there, which somehow doesn't actually exist. And because of that problem in cognition, because of that wrong identification, we experience pain and suffering. Now, if we learn to awaken to our true nature, to recognize that transcendental aspect, which is who we truly are, according to this vision, then also the suffering will cease. The main difference between the Buddhist vision and the Advaita vision related to this topic of suffering and awakening, there's of course all kind of other nuance, is that Vedanta also acknowledge some kind of existence after the awakening. Not in any individual sense, but there are some attributes to the divine consciousness, which is existence, consciousness, and bliss. And then when you're spending time in Advaita circles and listening to the teachings, you notice that beside this idea that you find in Buddhism that we cut the cycle of death and rebirth and we stop to exist, and because of that, there's no more pain and no more suffering, an idea that Buddhist people usually don't really like to talk about today, because for most Western people, that sounds just a little bit odd. In Advaita Vedanta, there is some kind of a everlasting, happy scenario. You are not your individual self, so it's a little bit hard to understand who is experiencing that bliss, but your individual consciousness will dissolve into the supreme consciousness, which is existence, consciousness, and bliss. From this point onwards, we can somewhat generalize and say that the majority of the orthodox and heterodox philosophies of the Indian subcontinent had one version or another of this concept of moksha or liberation from suffering. This is up until we come to the Tantric schools of northern India, Kashmir. This idea of liberation, of course, is also there, and we can also see some aspects of this going free, becoming free from pain and suffering. But those ideas are not so much front and center. They are not as prevalent anymore because their metaphysical approach, their metaphysical vision of reality is quite different of the previous philosophies that we talked about. Here, in this emerging tantric philosophy, we find something which they call the Advaita, the supreme non-duality, to differentiate from the Advaita Vedanta version of non-duality. And with this more inclusive and embracive vision, also the idea of liberation and freedom shifts. Instead of liberation and freedom from the world, this transcendental vision, we find more holistic, more embracive vision, which is a vision of liberation in the world. Instead of nirvikalpa samadhi, the samadhi of cessation, we find sahaja samadhi, we find bhava samadhi, which is the natural samadhi, or the samadhi with the eyes open. In this new vision, the practitioner is being guided to realize and recognize everything in reality, both manifest and unmanifest, consciousness and energy, transcendental and immanence, all as aspect of that divine holistic reality. There's always a problem with finding a word which is not pointing to one aspect or another, but here the idea that any kind of aspect that we find is all part of that divinity, that ultimate, that absolute sense. It's all inclusive and not just transcendental. And because of that, everything in life become a vehicle for liberation. The practitioner is being guided to try to look for, to recognize, to see in every aspect, everything that happens throughout our life, that divine spark, which is actually holding everything, which is actually expressing itself through everything in reality, as well as through you. And with that sense of inclusion, also things that were condemned before to be low or dirty or even taboo are being embraced. We see more expression of even wrathful deities. There are specific aspects where the divine consciousness is being described as horrifying or terrifying or scary. And all of those are different facets of that all-inclusive divinity. This was a major step forward in our evolution and understanding of spirituality and reality at large. Moving from the more dualistic vision of reality to Advaita Vedanta version of non-duality, and then from Advaita Vedanta to the Paradvaita, the supreme non-dual vision, which was much more embracive towards life and the world. And from here, the next step forward will be starting to lean into Integral-Tantrism and to trans-dualism, this term being used for a lack of a better word in this moment. But all of this goes way beyond the scope of this video, so let's go back to the gift of suffering. Now, before we continue, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge and to make sure that it's clear that when I'm talking here about Advaita Vedanta and Buddhism, I'm really oversimplifying. There's so many more details and nuance to both of those traditions, but I'm just trying to very briefly highlight the topics that are relevant for our conversation today. As I mentioned before, most of us can recognize that a certain amount of challenge, even struggle, depends on the circumstance, can actually be very beneficial and necessary for our growth and development. But what about mental pain, depression, negative self-talk? Now I would like to go through some of those arguments, starting with the most easy one to make and slowly progressing to the more difficult ones, and see how those struggles, the pain and the suffering that we experience in our lives are actually very necessary and are here to help us to grow, help us to evolve. Starting with physical pain, this is very straightforward. if we don't take the position of the Buddhist, which is more antinatalist, the idea that not existing is better than existing, and we're saying that life does have some kind of intrinsic value, it's better to exist, it's better to be alive, we can also recognize that being alive in a physical body involves certain amounts of physical pain. Like the Buddha said, being born, having your bones grow, your teeth, etc., all of those things takes a certain amount of pain and physical suffering in order to exist. And if we value that existence more than non-existence, then on this level, we should also embrace those challenges as part of that reality. Most people do not consider planet Earth or Gaia as a sentient beings. But if we look at things even on that scale, we can see that in order to create the environment which is supporting our life, our existence today, there were enormous collisions, earthquakes, volcanoes. There was endless amount of death and destruction that needed to occur in order for us to exist and to have this environment for us today. There is no life without death, just as there's no pleasure without pain. And although in the largest vision there is a connectivity, there's an aspect of monism that connects between everything that exists, in our direct experience, reality is to an extent dualistic. And if we want to experience all the range of emotions and sensations, pain is also a part of it. When we try to acquire skills, even let's say like going to the gym, this becomes very, very evident. We literally break down and destroy the muscle in order to promote growth, in order to become stronger. We experience pain in order to experience more health and benefits after. Any kind of motor skill that you're trying to learn will involve a certain amount of pain, of struggle. Suffering might be a little bit difficult word to put in here, but to some extent, if you want to learn a musical instrument, if you're trying to play a guitar, if you tried, you know, the beginning is very painful. There's a lot going on here. But this pain is being transformed, and it's also some kind of a barrier that makes you also appreciate and actually embrace even more the experience of being able to play or being able to perform the skill later on. Lastly, physical pain is here to protect us and keep us safe. Physical pain is necessary for our survival. It helps us to know what is dangerous, how to remember when something was there to harm us, and how to keep us safe for the future. After physical pain, we also have emotional pain. We have a whole range of emotions, and a bunch of them are deemed as negative emotions. Those are the emotions that generally are not pleasant to feel. But in a closer look, we can really easily see that they are absolutely necessary. They help us to go through the very difficult processes in our life. They help us to eventually see wider, bigger pictures. They help us to mature and to become greater human beings. If you ever went through a heartbreak, you know that the feeling is horrible. You feel that the whole world is collapsing around you and there is no more reason to live. But if you are old enough, then you went through those processes and you were able to mature through them, you know that there is tomorrow. Life too goes on. And it's almost a cliche to say, but the cracks is where the light shines through. It's through the way that you break, that you hurt, and then hopefully heal properly, that you become a more whole human being, that you learn to love even more. I remember a very good friend of mine that she was in a difficult time with her partner. I would not go into the details here, but she was in ruins and she was crying and half shouting and talking to herself. And she was going through something along saying, what to do? I'm so in pain. I'm so broken. My heart, I cannot take it anymore. What should I do? Should I close down and never love again because it's so painful? And from there, immediately answering to herself, saying, no, I will put myself together so I would learn to love even deeper, so my heart would grow even bigger, so I would be more whole, more complete, and I would love again. And this aspect, this attitude, this process goes through the breaking, this process goes through the pain, and is necessary for us to go through it in order to grow and mature. When we look at things like grief, when we lose somebody that we love, I mean, the pain is unbearable. It it is so painful and so horrible to know that a loved one passed, and maybe in not so nice circumstances. But nevertheless, the grief is a process that again helps us to heal. It is painful, but is beneficial. It helps us to process the crying, the suffering. It moves us into the next step. Now, if you've been in some spiritual circles, you might have heard all kind of enlightened perspectives where you say that you shouldn't really suffer in this case because nobody really goes anywhere, or the soul went to a good place. Whatever story you are relating with, I'm not making fun out of it. I'm just saying different people have different perspective around that, with the idea that you shouldn't suffer. It's not a sad thing that somebody dies, but from a very mature place and with the most highest perspective, still, with the departing of the present of someone that was dear to you, there is some pain, there is grief. But now the grief could be transformed. You can stay present with the pain, and the pain become a thing of a sharp beauty. There is an honoring, there is respect. You are still there in one piece, but the pain is still in the heart. You are not disregarding it, you are not bypassing it. You are honoring it and allowing it to transform you, to take you deeper. And in the same way, all of the different emotions that we experience are here to tell us something, are here to guide us, are here to help us to process life and to emerge different, greater, more mature. Anger, pain, sadness, all of them like are trying to tell us that maybe our values are not being met, or somebody crossed our boundaries, so we have an emotional reaction. What do we do with that emotional reaction is a different story, but the experience of the emotion is necessary. I think a couple of years ago there was a beautiful movie called Inside Out, where the whole narrative is that we need sadness in order to process and connect with other people. And this is another very important element, how our so called negative emotions, when we are vulnerable and open about them, help us to create more rapport and more connection with the people that we love. Embracing all of those aspects and those so called negative emotions or processes is fundamentally important for this new holistic vision, moving us away from this more transcendental vision of spirituality and enlightenment to a much more humane and embodied one. Now, if you spend enough time on this planet and you would reflect on your own life and the life of the people around you, you will probably see that some of the struggle and challenges that you face in your life helped you to mature. And this is very important for us in Integral-Tantrism, as we don't focus anymore only on waking up practices, but also growing up in stages of development is very important for us. When we see in our life people that didn't really struggle, that didn't need to strive or work hard, where everything was given to them, there's also the notion that a lot of them, again, not all, but it's very common, that they turn up to be quite superficial. Ironically, people that didn't suffer or struggle in life also find it very difficult to find meaning. Everything seems to be flat. There is no appreciation for what they actually have. They tend to be more arrogant, more entitled, because they didn't need to work for what they have. And this aspect of having meaning in your life is maybe the most important thing for everyone. It doesn't matter what else you achieve or don't achieve in life. If you feel that your life don't have any meaning, we become nihilistic. We don't really enjoy anything. We become flat and we kind of like lose our soul. Meaning is maybe the most important thing that we should be concerned with in our life as we construct our spiritual practice, our view of the universe, our relationship. What are we going to do here? And as right now we are seem to be in a global meaning crisis, we start to realize that the things that actually gives life meaning are not so much our rights or the benefits that we get from things, but more our responsibilities, our challenges, where we're able to show up for others. And in the same way, also the struggle and the pain that we went through in life is one of the main things that help us to derive meaning into our existence. The last thing is that emotional pain and suffering are really vital in order to be able to develop compassion. Now, it's not that you cannot be compassionate or to try to relate to another person if you didn't go through emotional pain and suffering. But the extent that you went through those turmoils increases your capacity to be able to understand what it is to be in somebody else's shoes. You don't need to go through the exact pain and suffering that somebody else is going through in order to be compassionate. But going through turmoil in your own life allows you to connect also to that pain and to understand what somebody else is going through. I've seen it in my own life when people that actually had things handed to them a bit too easily, even spiritual teachers that talks about compassion quite a lot, actually not being able to be compassionate at all. I mean, they thought they were, but what came across to most people is much more of sympathy than compassion. It's kind of like, yeah, I see you going through that thing over there. That looks really shitty. Oh, poor you. But like me, I'm not really being moved by this because also I cannot really relate. It just looks a bit lame or sad what you're going through. I'm giving here a bit more of an anecdotal example, but overall, I have seen that going through turmoil, going through pain, going through suffering allows you to relate to people that are suffering in a much more deeper and profound level. And the compassion that you feel and the compassion that they feel that you feel can really transform and create a very deep and profound connection. After talking about the physical and emotional pain, now we'll talk about mental pain. And this is maybe the most difficult argument to defend. Mental pain is this process where we have endless repetitive thoughts, negative self talk that just constantly weigh us down. Now, sometimes those things are getting triggered because of external circumstances, but for the sake of the conversation, I really want to push the envelope even a bit farther and give the example where the individual is actually engaging with the pain. We are actively perpetuating the negative self talk, the repetitive thoughts, all of these negative ideas that are just bringing us lower and lower and lower. And those things can last for hours, days, and in some cases, even years, which eventually also causing like severe depression and other mental afflictions. This is without a doubt the type of pain and suffering that all spiritual traditions are aiming to eradicate, where everybody is saying that this is not necessary. This is just something that you do to yourself. Even if you don't believe in this whole thing of not reincarnating anymore, saying that as long as you are in the physical body, there will be physical pain. But this mental pain that you are creating for yourself is just self inflicted. You don't need it. You can get rid of it. You just need to learn how to control your mind, change your perspective, and never experience this again. And still, I would say that yes, even this is necessary. Even this is part of the experience of the human being, because at some points in our evolution, in our growth, in our life, we need those dark nights. It's almost a cliche to talk about how some of the greatest arts that we ever seen have come because somebody was depressed, somebody was heartbroken, somebody even was suffering from a mental illness. From the darkest places comes the brightest light. And the way that we suffer, the way that we even inflict the pain on ourselves, molds us in very specific ways that allows us to become certain individuals later on in life. We are not striving to become um, perfect, to become all peaceful, to become all knowing, but to transmit, to allow the light of the divine consciousness to shine in the very particular way that it's shining only through us. And going sometimes through years of pain and suffering allows us to not only understand things that nobody else can, but to bring that light in a way that nobody else can. And that light shines in the world and being expressed because you were in some way willing to go through that journey, to endure the pain, to endure the suffering, to churn within it, to come in this specific form, to allow the divine to express itself. And in that way, there is nothing that is being left out. The divine is working through the individual soul, experiencing all those different facets, through the pain, through the anger, through the laughter. All of them together are helping us to become who we are. And overall, we realize that it is our pain as much as our joy and pleasure that molds us, that carves us into the unique expression of who we are. And we can even argue that these long, dark nights, when we have this negative self talk, which is as if we are digging ourselves into a hole, going deeper and deeper into the darkness, is presenting us with an opportunity to, at some point in our journey into the darkness, to hit gold and discover the light. And if we are lucky enough to be blessed by the presence of the grace and to heal from those processes, we're able to bring that gold, to bring that light from the darkness back into our lives. After addressing the physical, emotional, and mental, if we look towards the spiritual life, if we look to the stories of the great saints and sages, yogis and yoginis, people that we see as spiritual beings, we can definitely and actually quite easily see that one of the great motivations that most of these people had was the pain and the suffering that they encounter in their life and so in the life of the people around them, wanting to solve the suffering or finding a deeper calling in the heart to connect to God, to realize their true nature. In recent years, we have the examples of Eckhart Tolle or Byron Katie, people that were so depressed, they had such an enormous self-loathing and hatred towards themselves. They wanted to die, they wanted to commit suicide. And from that dark place, after all hope was abandoned, from that place, they have awakened. Something has cracked and shifted, and from the midst of depression, they found the light and realized their true nature. So, realizing all of that, seeing those things happening again and again, who are we to say that all of this pain and suffering, confusion, delusion, ignorance as well, everything that we experience, how can we say that is anything else but the hand of God, caressing our heart, directing us, helping us to realize that in the background, behind all of those experiences, there's nothing else but love? All right. So now that we realize that, it does not mean that we lose any sense of discernment and we're going to run out into the world looking to inflict pain and suffering on ourselves and others. Of course not. There is enough pain and suffering to be had whether we like it or not. Quite the contrary. We still aim to reduce pain and suffering for all sentient beings in all places, and we aim to increase well-being overall. As well, it is very important that we don't become ambivalent towards pain and suffering, that we are still being moved, that we are feeling compassion, that we are caring, that we understand how difficult those processes are to go through. And we want to support people to go through them, whether it's us or them, as much as it's necessary, but also to try to make it as easy as we can. It's very important that we don't fall into some kind of spiritual bypassing and we become detached or indifference from those pains and saying things like, just witness, just observe, just surrender, it's all okay. When you're in the shit, it feels like you're in the shit. And the whole point of being compassionate is to realize that and not patronize the other person or yourself as you're going through this. If you have the capacity to have this wider perspective and also witness as you're in the midst of it, not disconnecting from the pain, because this is repression, that's not witnessing, then that's wonderful if you are able to stay present with it. But overall, we want to stay in touch with the heart, to know that going through those pains, as much as necessary it may be at some places, at some point for certain people, it is still not easy. And we want to reduce the pain for those who are suffering as much as possible. What we are leaning towards here is to slowly, and to whatever degree is possible, to start and shift our attitude and increase our capacity to stay present and even embrace the pain and suffering that we encounter, knowing that they may have come to us for a reason and there might be even some kind of a blessing in disguise. We're trying to shift our attention, change the attitude, try to listen, to hear what is the message, what those things are here to tell us, what are we supposed to learn from this experience. And as I mentioned before, is absolutely crucial that you keep your discernment going through this process, that you're able to see the difference between talking or contemplating things on the absolute sense, where everything is connected, and also to recognize that things do operate in the relative realm, where duality still exists. As you go deeper into your journey, your capacity to hold both of those perspectives simultaneously will increase. Nevertheless, the journey could be quite bumpy until we get there. Finally, I have noticed that maturing towards an integral awakening that includes both waking up through states of consciousness and growing up through stages of development is a type of awakening that actually does not reduce or eliminate suffering by any means. On the contrary, it actually tends to increase the amount of pain and suffering that you experience and witness in the world. But what changes is your capacity to be present and to hold that pain. You are not being thrown away by it and run over by the pain to the point that you cannot function anymore, but you can stay present. You can give a place in your heart for the pain to exist, your pain and others. And with that aspect of presence, with that aspect of embracing the pain with love, there is a transformation that occurs in your heart, both to yourself and to the world around you. This capacity to embrace the most difficult of things, to recognize them as not separate or different from your true essence, allowing them to be experienced and transformed in your heart, recognizing your true nature and the nature of things is what we aimed at in Integral Awakening.